Hello, everybody. So this time we're going to be just kind of giving a kind of theoretical and conceptual wrap up of modes and kind of a gearing up for next week, but also really for the rest of the quarter. And also I'm going to spend some time doing a bit of symmetrical scale refresh because we haven't done that since last quarter, and we spent a lot of time last quarter. So I want to make sure that we really kept that skill set. So let's go ahead and talk about kind of modes, because believe it or not, we're at the end of modes already. We're only spending 2 weeks on modes. There's not much more to do than we've done already. So we're kind of at the end of that. So some final thoughts here. Modes open up worlds of possibility for both listeners and for composers. So, especially in a Western classical tradition, to a certain point, you really only get major and minor. You can get wonderful chromaticism to bridge different major and minor keys, and the 3 different types of minor and all these things like that. But you can basically multiply all of those systems by however many notes are in that scale to give you even more possibilities. And as listeners, this opens you up to older repertoire. But it also opens you up to newer repertoire and being able to orally understand and engage with newer material that also uses modes. And then for composers, this allows you to kind of it gives you more tools in your toolbox. So modes are really interesting because they have different expressive purposes. So you could write in modes and not think of them in terms of their character, but in terms of their kind of expressive possibilities. Or you could use modes, as many composers do, and use them to suggest something kind of ancient or something exotic. Okay, I would caution against the exotic use of those, but but as an example, for anybody who plays video games, the very famous score for the video game Halo mocks Gregorian chant and has its opening chorus to start off the game is just Dorian. It's just a Dorian mode little melody there. So you can use these things to suggest other material and suggest older music, even if you don't want to necessarily be explicit with that. So some of the types of music that we've talked about a little bit here that uses modes are Renaissance, popular music, folk music, progressive rock, metal, etc. I really wanted to try to find some metal to give all of you, but it's really hard to do a dictation of metal. So in any case, understanding that a lot of metal is just operating with some of those modes, basically power chords and stuff like that, you find Locrian mode in metal far more frequently than I think anywhere else. So that's maybe a way in, for instance, to new genres. I'm not a big folk music person, but listening for kind of how folk music interacts with different modes and uses modes as key areas in some cases is kind of interesting. So we've only covered one modal system. I mentioned this in the very first lecture in week 1, that we're only covering one, that there's other that exist. So I'm going to go ahead and summarize a couple of those right now, because if any interest you, just reach out to me. But these are things that you can also do on your own, where, in a broad sense, this isn't necessarily how it always works out, but in a broad sense, any scale that is not symmetrical can be used modally. So for instance, a really common one that you see actually surprisingly a lot are modes of melodic minor. So if you take the melodic minor scale, just the ascending permutation, you get so many wonderful possibilities with that, because by raising those pitches at the end, you get this kind of whole tone sound, but then you also get this minor in there. And by interacting with modes of that, you get these really wonderful and interesting modal systems. So for instance, a really common one that Debussy used and that a lot of composers use, and particularly jazzers, is you could have what we call a Lydian mixolydian scale, where it sounds kind of like both, where the first part of the scale, it sounds like Lydian, and then it ends mixolydian. Right? Because the third mode of melodic minor, if you start, the fourth mode of melodic minor, if you start there, you get this kind of interesting, like, double mode identity, and so on. And there's so many more than that. You've got, like, something that we call kind of like harmonic major, where you've got this kind of major sound, but then at the end, you've got this flat 6th there, which is kind of interesting. Probably not harmonic major, but in any case, I don't want to get off track with that. Tons of possibility there. Tons of possibility. So for improvisation, if you're an improvisational musician, or if you're interested in writing more interesting melodies, modes are another way to potentially do that, and you can still tie modes to a tonal context by how you orchestrate it. So pentatonic modes, of course, so instead of, for instance, the fifth mode of pentatonic just becomes the blues scale, right? So, and then diatonic modes using other tuning systems. So if you're an electronic musician, or if you have access to nicer keyboards or access to period instruments, you can do diatonic modes with older tuning systems. So do, say, G Phrygian, but do the C just tuning, for instance. You can get kind of weird stuff going on with that, which is kind of interesting. So modes point us forwards as much as they point us backwards. So modes came into popularity again in the late 19th and into the 20th century. And this kind of resurgence brought the new back to the present, or pardon me, the old back to the present again. And this opened the door for something we call PanDiatonicism, which is actually going to tie us neatly into next week's material and kind of bridge modes into the 20th century. So let's go ahead and talk about PanDiatonicism a bit. So PanDiatonicism is like modality, but without center pitches. So we've still got 7 notes, right? Just white notes, right? If you want to think of it in that term. But it's more analogous to serialism than it is to tonality, because there's no center pitches, and you can invert and change melodies. So for instance, you know, if the melody does this, you could just have a different part where the melody goes down and harmonize it like that, right? Kind of a lame example, but it gets more interesting than that. Inverted, retrograded, manipulated. The example I have at the bottom of the page here is actually jazz piano voicings. As you can see that you've got fourths in the left hand, and all the notes are just white notes. And you could do an analysis of this, but it wouldn't be functional. And that's kind of the thing here, is that you've got this kind of diatonic sound, but not diatonic function, and no center pitches. So arrival is entirely derived through things like voice leading and motive. Okay, we're going to talk about more of this next week, but examples of this can be found in Copland, Debussy, Ravel, Steve Reich, Stravinsky. Some modal jazz is pandiatonic, and even the Beatles have pandiatonic pieces. So pandiatonicism is kind of where Rogers and Ottman picks us up in chapter 21, which is where we're going next time. So keep that in mind. It's kind of modes, but now even farther removed from their kind of tonal analogs. Okay. So let's do some review of symmetrical scales. I'll try to keep this brief because we did it last quarter, but we really need to make sure that we have these skills sharp moving forwards, because they're going to come back with a vengeance here pretty soon. Okay. So whole tone scale. It's a scale of whole tones. You know, it's pretty straightforward and easy to remember. So only whole steps. And because of that, because of how transposition works, there's only 2 possibilities. So if we do this, right? It only takes us 6 notes to get where we're going, because there's only 12 notes, and if you just whole steps is 2 semitones each, 6. And if you transpose the first note up a half step, you get all the other pitches. And then if you go up another half step, you're back at the first whole tone scale again. Okay? So there's only 2 possibilities to worry about. But because there's 6 notes in the scale, it means that one of our lines or spaces will always be skipped. So as you can see here on this example, in that top stave, B is not accounted for because we go from A sharp to C. That's a whole step, so we don't need a B at all. And then in the bottom example, notice that we skip C entirely. We go from B to D flat, okay, and so on. What's also interesting about whole tones and why they're so, I think, so interesting is that they only yield augmented triads when you stack them in thirds. So for instance, we have major thirds, right? All major thirds, but if you stack as if you're making a triad, in stacked thirds, of course, they're all augmented, right? You can do clusters with that, and so on. Or you could do bigger leaps where they're kind of like, they sound kind of like 7th chords, and so on. So that's kind of how harmony can interact with this. So if you want an example, I would definitely listen to Debussy's piano piece Follis. It's from one of his books of preludes, and the entire thing is written with the whole tone scale. for the most part. So really interesting, really striking, really beautiful stuff. Whole tones are really interesting, and a lot of composers use them in fleeting moments here and there. Like that piece is a rare example where it's used primarily throughout, but whole tones appear a lot more than you would think when you start looking for them. So especially whole tone scales over augmented triads. So if you have something like this, where, you know, say we're going to G. Right? Something like that. So the other symmetrical scale that we've been talking about for a while now is the octatonic scale. 8 pitches, hence octa. This is an alternation of whole steps and half steps. They allow for a variety of wonderful harmonic possibilities because you can create major triads related by minor third, or 4 different fully diminished possibilities. Due to the symmetry, you only get 3 permutations, okay? So I have all 3 at the bottom there for you. And here's what one of them sounds like. We did this last quarter. Because there's 8 notes, you're going to have a pitch doubled at some point. So as you can see, for instance, in this, the top stave of the example, you can see that F is doubled. We've got F and F sharp. And such. So as I mentioned, you can stack them in, you know, thirds like triads and do something like this. Right? Or you could create diminished 7th chords. All those chords I just played 8 chords for you. All of them are within this scale. So octatonic scales are super interesting, and Stravinsky in particular is very famous for them. He's got a piece that's wonderful and actually has a really kind of memorable melody. If you want to kind of hear what whole tone melodies, octatonic melodies sound like, he's got a piece aptly. It's an octet for wind instruments. So I definitely check that out. It's a really, really interesting piece, and whole tones can be tricky because octatonic can be tricky because unlike the whole tones where it's somewhat more predictable, in this case because it's alternations of half steps and whole steps, it's a bit harder to keep track, I think. So you have to really rely on intervals to sing through this. So this is where we're going in the future. We'll be back to octatonic and whole tones soon, so practice along with these. Take note of the scales I have on the slides, and go ahead and sing through them on your own time, because eventually we're going to be doing some of those out of Rodgers and Ottman. Okay, so let's talk about what we're doing next week. Modes are done. We are through with modes. We have PanDiatonicism, but again, that's not really modes. That's kind of its own thing. We are officially in the 20th century. Okay, so week 3 and 4, we're going to cover chapter 21 in Rodgers and Ottman. Week 5 will be the midterm, and then the rest of the quarter we're going to do something else. It'll still be in the 20th century, but we're actually going to get a different book. I will send that all out to you when the time comes, but we're going to spend the rest of the quarter from week 6 to the end on actually a completely different textbook. Okay, that's all post-tonal sight singing. Okay, so it'll be really fun. We'll get to sing a lot of really interesting music and really open up kind of our expressive possibilities here. So next week is going to specifically focus on 20th century rhythm and extended tonality. So we're going to be doing lots of PanDiatonicism, and we're also going to be doing some pretty interesting and wacky rhythm. Week 4 will be when we really, really dig into dictating and singing through our symmetrical scales, but we're also going to get introductions to serialism and post-tonality. Okay, so it's going to ramp up pretty quickly here. As of recording, the midterm is still uncertain to me what that format's going to look like, so I'll let you know when I know. In the meantime, we'll go ahead and push through to week 5, and then after the midterm, we'll continue post-tonality through the end of the quarter. So once we get to week 4, we're in post-tonality all the way to the end, okay? So by now, as the time of this posting, homework for this weekend should be posted to GatcherSpace. So go ahead and check that out, and that'll be due on Monday, okay? So we're done with modes. Bye-bye modes. And we're moving forward to greener pastures next week. So with that, have a wonderful weekend, and I will see all of you next time.